comes from the German Regional League in 2006. Playing white is Johannes Wenzel. Playing black is a guy called Martain. And these two guys are graded about 2100. Once again, we see our system with Queen D8, and this time white decides to take theory completely out of the equation by playing G3. This is a fairly natural way of playing. It's quite common in all Scandinavian lines. Wherever black puts his queen on move 3, he can put it on A5, obviously he can put it on D6. He could even play it to E5. But somewhere, sometime, you're going to have to face a system with G3. And, well, white intends nothing more than natural development. He's not interested in theory. He's just going to place the bishop on G2 and try to put pressure on the black queen side. And when black plays C6, he's got to be aware that in this system, white has a plan of perhaps pushing the queen side pawns. He's intending ideas such as A4, B4, Rook B1, and then B5. And after that, the white bishop could get to grips with the black queen side. So whatever black does, it's got to be geared up to meeting this idea. All right, Luft played knight F6, and after knight GE2, he played his bishop to F5. He doesn't seem particularly perturbed by this idea at all. White plays H3, black plays H6, white plays D3, and now black plays E6. White castles, black plays bishop E7, and now it's really down to white to find the plan. Wenzel just plays knight E4, continuing with these natural moves. Black plays knight BD7, and we can easily say that black has equalised from the opening. Okay, white's position is very solid, but not much else. Going back to bishop E7, could white have done better? Well, a move like Rook B1 seems to me to be much more thematic. And against that, I think black should play A5. Should white play A3, renewing the idea of B4, I think black should once again stop white's plan dead in its tracks with knight A6. And again, what is wrong with black's position? Well, nothing at all. Of course, there's nothing wrong with white's position either. It's just level with all to play for. Black has put a halt to white's ambitions on the queen side for the time being. If black ever gets troubled by the idea of B5, then he can generally stick on a knight on D5 to block the diagonal, and he should be perfectly okay. However, I think that probably would have been a more sensible way for white to proceed than what happens, because after knight E4, knight BD7, knight 2 to C3, castles, basically white has nothing at all in this position. And black has emerged from the opening in perfectly good shape. Well, white plays A3. With nothing better to do, he just gives himself the option of B4. Black plays knight D5. Of course, I suppose black could have played A5 and tried to restrict white. That would have been another way. Knight D5 is okay. Queen E1. Bishop comes back to A7. And now F4 reveals perhaps a darker side to white's ambitions. Could white be thinking about advancing on the king side? The queen on E1, well, that was most peculiar looking when it was played, but is white intending G4 and then queen to G3? This would at least make sense of white's pieces. In chess, you've got to make sense of your pieces. I've said it once before on this DVD, it's all about development, but development for development's sake is not enough. You've got to have reasons for putting your pieces on the squares where they go to. And so, you know, I'm looking for white to actually make sense of his queen. Otherwise, I just don't understand what that queen is doing on E1. Well, black took on C3. White recaptured with the knight. And now black decided to play knight F6. After which white parked his king in the corner. Black continued with queen C7. He's now thinking about bringing his rooks into the game. Usually a move like queen C7 would be followed by rook A D8. Of course, with the pawn on D3, this is perhaps less attractive. But nevertheless, a rook to D8 is a sensible idea. And, well, possibly with the idea of pushing the queenside pawns after the rook comes to D8, black can play A6, and then C5 and maybe C4. Trying to undermine pawn couplet on D3 and C2. This is one reasonable plan. Queen F2. We still don't know quite how this game is going to shape up. Maybe queen f2 is tying down the rook on a8 because the pawn on a7 is attacked at that point. So black plays knight d5 and white plays knight e4. b6, bishop d2, rook a d1, rook f8, and now white plays c4. This for me is a critical moment in the game, so let's just drop back. Okay, I think basically in this position, it's about level. It's quite complicated because there are a lot of pieces on the board, but we don't actually know quite how this game is going to shape up. Probably, if I was white, I would take the view here that I have nothing. I'm not at all sure how white should proceed. Objectively, I think his best move is probably to play knight c3 for a draw. I mean, I think that's the most sensible way to view this position. I think it is equal. I think if you want to win with white in such a situation, you've got to be prepared to take a risk. Therefore, c4 is that risk, because after knight f6, basically you've weakened your pawn couplet on c3, on c4 and d3. Now white's got to, I mean, white is basically, when he plays c4, playing for the win flat out, because now the rook on d8 starts to make a lot more sense. I'm not at all sure whether this wasn't the losing move, actually, c4, in a higher sense, because it gives black something to fight on. Obviously, white feels that he could deal with black's pressure with bishop c3, but, well, judge for yourselves, because as the game goes, white starts to get into trouble because of his weakened pawn structure. Well, black retreats with knight d7. White goes queen f3, and now black goes c5, perhaps fixing this pawn on d3. An interesting regrouping idea for black, a plan perhaps, is to think about targeting the d4 square. Of course, that won't be at all easy to do with white's queen and bishop on the long diagonal, but that's certainly something to be kept in mind. g4 by white, f6 by black, blocking the diagonal, and now white gets out of the way with knight g3. Bishop g6 keeps the knight out of h5, and now white comes in with queen c6. Black goes bishop d6, queen takes c7, bishop takes c7, and now white pins the knight with bishop c6, after which black is keen to get out of the pin and plays rook e7. King comes to g2, bishop goes to f7, and white plays bishop e4. And now black plays knight f8. Okay, the position still hasn't clarified. Rook de1 was played. Knight g6. And around here, it's starting to get a little bit shaky for white, because now white's starting to think about his pawns. You know, it's all very well to push these pawns, but pawns can't move backwards. And suddenly, white is under fire on f4. It's slightly surprising, this. Nothing seems to be going on. The two players seem to be just moving those pieces around very quietly, not a lot happening. But now white has to think about defending suddenly. And how does he defend that pawn on f4? Naturally, he doesn't want to play bishop d2 in this position. That would be a backward move. But after knight e2, it turns out he suddenly walked into a tactic, the remarkable idea f5, and suddenly white is in trouble. It's remarkable. If he retreats with bishop f3, the pawn on d3 is on free. If he takes on f5, black recaptures, and remarkably, white doesn't have a move in this position. When he played bishop takes f5 in the game, I've no doubt at all he was absolutely gobsmacked after knight h4 check. But what option did white have? If he retreats with bishop f3, black has two promising moves. He can play knight h4 check, or he may play a simple rook takes d3. Let's take a look at knight h4 check. King g3 must be played, and now black has a whole host of promising continuations. promising of which is g5, with ongoing pressure. Black need not even take on d3, although he could do so. So, of course, bishop takes f5, knight h4 check was the end of the game. Wenzel resigned and, probably scratching his head, went away thinking, how did I lose that game? Nothing seemed to be happening, and then suddenly I lost. Well, the reason he lost, of course, is that he was a bit impatient with his pawn pushes. In general, and we must return all the way to the opening here, the system with g3 is a very solid one. Black can proceed in the normal manner, just by lining up his pieces in the approved way. And but this is going to be a game of chess. What I mean by that is the best player is probably going to win. It's not a system where White's hoping for any theoretical advantage. It's not even a very sharp system. As long as you're aware of Black's plans and are fairly modest, you should get a reasonable position every time against g3.